Amen.
And as I said on Rosh Hashanah, the mythos is that God writes us in the book, and I believe that at the very least we partner with divinity to write ourselves in that book. We take much responsibility, and I'm really, really pleased and excited to bring up two people tonight to give some words of the heart about taking responsibility in this world. Wilderness Torah is consciously taking a journey of learning how to become a more open, more equitable organization. And with a generous grant from the Jews of Color Initiative, supported by the Rodan Foundation, we are lucky to have been able to fund two called JEDI consultants. Our JEDI masters are here working on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And I'm really, really excited that they flew all the way from Chicago to be with us. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Acasia Wilson and David Feinberg, known as Wilson Feinberg, JEDI Masters. That's just me, I'm playing. Please come on up and share your stories with us. Thank you for bringing your stories into the field of Teshuvah this evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having us.
Gemar Chatima Tova. I am David Feinberg.
And I'm Acasia Wilson Feinberg. David and I recently celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary. It feels important on this night as we're thinking about vows and the significance of vows. We've discovered so much over the years. We're a biracial couple, and we're from different geographical, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds. Our differences have not always been easy to navigate, but through 17 years of life together, we've built a foundation of love, trust, empathy, and true partnership across these lines of difference. Through this, we've recognized a deeper humanity in ourselves and in others. We often call upon these insights to raise two beautiful and strong Black and Jewish children. Over the past few years of racial and civic unrest, we felt compelled to engage more directly, and we began consulting as a team with organizations working toward advancing educational, racial, and economic equality.
Tonight on Kol Nidre, we annul the litany of vows. We preemptively ask for forgiveness for pledges we may not keep. And we thought in preparation for a day of personal and community atonement, we wanted to return to some of the stories that brought us here, brought us together, brought us to be with you. So tonight we're going to use the ritual of Teshuvah, repentance and returning, to revisit those heart and head places that we often revisit to find a source of fuel for the passion and the energy we need, that we call upon in our work toward justice.
When I reflect on some of the specific moments that have moved me into action and into a heart place, I often think about childhood. I come from a proud and hard-working family that escaped the Jim Crow South and headed to Portland, Oregon, where they were promised equal treatment and fair wages for their work. On my mother's side, they migrated from Mississippi and Texas. On my father's side, from Louisiana. Our family valued education and established a life for us where we grew our own food and benefited from everything the land in the Pacific Northwest had to offer. But over time, the cracks in this sort of post-racial fantasy began to show. The systemic disinvestment in communities and domestic terrorism that Blacks faced in other parts of the country increasingly became a part of our reality in Portland. Our family remained a close and strong force bound together through our care for each other and through our church community. But sadly, I experienced a number of racially motivated incidents as a young Black girl. The one that is most present for me lately is a time where I felt particularly vulnerable and afraid because I was with my young brothers. I first want to bring you into my 12-year-old landscape. In my 6th grade year, the family agreed that none of the schools in our community were suitable for my brothers and me. So it was determined, for better or for worse, that we would attend a school in a community that was better, which in this case meant a school in a white community where the facilities and level of instruction were considered superior. The school was across town and required either 2 or 3 public buses to get there, depending on the route. There's something about that long bus ride across town that always stung. I knew what I was gaining, but also what I lost every time I left my neighborhood. That was made even more clear by the attitudes of the white community that I encountered. I often felt afraid as the big sister caring for my brothers because they were only 5 and 7 years old. Once, as we were waiting for the bus across the street from school, a car raced by, hurling the N-word at us along the way. I stood there almost shaking as the pedestrians and cars filled with unconcerned white faces drove by, trying not to show my brothers how terrified I was. How deep was this hatred? Were they cowards who were just trying to make us feel badly, or would they go further? When the bus finally came, I darted on with my brothers, sat them down, and slumped over with relief in my seat. I recently drove that bus route again as we visited Portland with the kids. I see it differently now. I wondered about the white poverty that existed on the fringe of that community and how systemic disinvestment had hurt them too. I was filled with compassion instead of fear.
As a young boy, I loved joining my dad to work alongside him. At the currency exchange business, he operated on 69th and Wentworth in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood on the south side. We would drive 25 miles from our quaint suburb on Chicago's North Shore to the largely black community where banks refused to locate and lend, and the skyline was dotted with infamous Robert Taylor homes. We would enter the store through a steel-plated, burglar-proof turnstile and sit behind bulletproof glass. Through a circle of air holes and a 1-inch clearance at the bottom of the glass, I would help my dad with customers and clients as he cashed checks and engaged in small talk. Conversations about Chicago sports teams, where to grab food, would provide to what seemed like shared human experiences to my 8-year-old self. And at the end of the day, we would drive 25 miles north back to our tranquil and leafy street. Now, just a few generations ago, the predominantly white community where I grew up had restrictive housing covenants prohibiting Jewish, black, and immigrant communities from acquiring homes. And in those intervening generations, as some of the Chicagoland Jewish community widened in conjunction with de facto segregation, we were able to live and feel at home there, while black and brown families remained very much excluded. I find myself returning to this memory frequently. It's one of the few vivid memories I have been with my father. I still feel his absence 34 years after his death, and the memory of being at work with him provides me a spiritual proximity. But as a community developer, an educator, a husband to an incredible black woman and parent of black children, I also feel shame and confusion in this memory. In just a few generations, my Ashkenazi community largely vacated the neighborhoods that were rich with the spiritual, cultural, and educational tenets of Jewish community and traded them in for a whitewashed version of America that was becoming available to us now. And as we vacated those large swaths of the city, I still try to find my truth in this story that continues to play out. I'm constantly wondering about the depths of our Teshuvah, the spiritual and physical places that we need to return to relocate ourselves in allyship with racial equity and economic equity.
David and I met at a teacher training institute in Houston, having both joined a movement for educational equity after graduating college. We likely could not have articulated this at the time, but based on our experiences, we were beginning to see the importance of collective action informed by community engagement. This work as educators in Phoenix became transformational for both of us. During that time, I worked in a vibrant community that was primarily Latino and Native American. I was determined to ensure that a world-class education was available to my 5th grade students in their own neighborhood. I understood that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity isn't. My students and I dealt with outdated materials and district policies that were meant to ensure that students who weren't native English speakers or assimilated enough into white culture would face systemic oppression. When I received the order to take all of the math textbooks written in Spanish and lock them in the closet, or else, I'd had enough. I went to the assistant superintendent to point out what seemed obvious to me. This was ridiculous in a community where several students were newly arrived from Mexico and spoke no English. His response was, and I quote, "I don't know why you're working so hard. Most of these kids are just going to end up with a towel and a squeegee," in reference to our local car wash.
I worked in the Roosevelt School District, immediately adjacent to Acasia's district. And I think about Yesenia and Jorge and Crystal, three of the most brilliant young people I'd ever taught, and who were just a few of my students that were new immigrants to the U.S. and spoke primarily Spanish. And as Acasia alluded to, in our first year of teaching, Arizona passed statewide legislation making it illegal to communicate in Spanish with students who are not in officially designated bilingual classrooms. Just to communicate and teach my students and build trust with them, I found myself breaking this law on a daily basis. Supporting my students and preserving and honoring their linguistic and cultural traditions was familiar, and it was important to me as a Jewish man who had learned repeatedly about how we have continued to struggle to preserve our culture and faith. Now, this was the first time in my professional career that I'd encountered a system built to oppress and criminalize youth and strip them of their capacity and humanity. The same year that law was passed, I lived in an apartment on Indian School Road. The street in Phoenix was named after one of the more infamous and repressive periods of U.S. and Arizona history. Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families to become educated in federally funded schools that actively taught them to assimilate into whiteness and denigrated their language and culture and history. I started seeing that the historical oppressions and community traumas endured by our people were still ever present.
Stories like these angered and frustrated us, but they also had power. We frequently connected as friends and as colleagues to reflect on what we saw playing out in systems and explore our personal connections to this work. I was surprised to learn of the extent to which there were parallels between the Jewish and Black experience. We lamented the ways in which our people, Jewish and Black, are often reduced to a single story about slavery or the Holocaust. We had similar stories of legacies that included discrimination, displacement, and triumph. We wanted to find ways, both personally and professionally, to extend the work that began in our classrooms to be broader and more systemic. The sense of urgency we felt deepened as we started a family of our own and began raising children who identify as both Black and Jewish. A famous comedian, Baratundi Thurston, once said that if you never want to talk about race, just marry someone who's the same race as you. Because we have to talk about race and racial justice every day in our home. It's in part because we believe it's necessary to keep our children, and particularly our Black son, safe.
We often find the power and richness in our respective cultures and stories and that which we're creating together, and through the act of Teshuvah, of returning, of repentance. And this permission and admonition that we continually revisit our core rituals and habits and practices allows us to fully process and metabolize and create the layers of meaning to our life experiences and apply those to our work. I still revisit an episode that occurred in 2006. We were spending a month in the community where my mother and stepfather lived. Acasia had gone shopping by herself, and upon entering a trendy retail store located on the town's commercial main street, she was greeted by a clerk who engaged in policing rather than customer service. Even then, I knew this was all too common experience for Black and brown people. Years later, the convenience store nearby our Chicago home would approach my cousin David, a beautiful Black man with the same type of retail policing. When Acasia shared her story, I feared that my community's involvement in this type of racist microaggression might implicate me as well. I wanted to attribute this act to one misguided employee, and I did not want to believe that the liberal Jewish community that championed its legacy as advocates of civil rights and human rights could also be perpetrators of oppression and racism. But here was a hard truth staring right at me, and accepting it would require me to return and redefine the story of my community. We are the people that showed up in allyship for the civil rights in the Freedom Summer of 1964, and before that, the labor movement turn of the century for economic justice. But that's only a half-truth. We're also Jared Kushner and Donald Sterling, Teshuvah, and Kol Nidre give us the space to reconcile the best of ourselves alongside the worst of ourselves, and confront that we are likely to foil our own commitments. But praying together in community can give us the sustenance to remain committed to justice and equity work and approach it with the love, patience, and compassion that we so deserve.
Given all of this and the larger context of the world, I feel more courageous than I ever have. Maybe it's in part because I have a growing body of people by my side. Maybe it's because I feel like I have to be, because of my kids and my family. Maybe it's because I'm just simply over feeling vulnerable and victimized as I have in the past. I've grown weary of seeing Black death sensationalized, and I wake up every day committed to working toward progress and change. At present, in addition to serving as a DEI facilitator, I lead a collective effort to support Black leadership in education. After 1 year, we've deployed over $5 million to support these leaders in deepening their impact. I've never felt more aligned from a values perspective to the change that I hope to see in the world. Black students need strong Black leaders, but perhaps even more importantly, all students need strong Black leaders, and Latinx leaders, and LGBTQ leaders, and Indigenous leaders, and all the leaders. My constant challenge is to ensure that I'm connecting this work to lived experiences, real stories, and true allies, and extending my impact beyond just the Black community.
This weekend, the community development organization where I work is co-sponsoring a neighborhood music festival that highlights the Black entrepreneurs, artists, and businesses that have led their equitable community development in Englewood Square, just a mile away from where I joined my dad at work more than 3 decades ago. So this, to me, must be one of the most cosmic forms of Teshuvah I've yet to experience. This cycle, this return to a moment that holds emotionally and cognitive dissonant and oppositional truths for me has helped me to make sense, I think, of what Kol Nidre is about. And here we are, in front of families, friends, partners, lovers, people we trust to hold us accountable, and we are asking to be absolved from any promise we make with ourselves and with God to become better and more just. And this ritual has long perplexed me. I think I'm only now starting to understand what Teshuvah is, what justice work is, and what it's really about. Faulkner famously said, "The past is not dead, it's not even the past." And I think that's part of what we're davening about here. We know ourselves well enough to know that as individuals and communities, we will continually interpret and reinterpret what has happened to us as we renew our pledges to do our role in advancing justice and peace, to survive and thrive, to be an active part of others' liberation as we liberate ourselves.
During this holiday and period of Teshuvah, we return to this profound ritual where we make vows and renounce them simultaneously, as we return time and time again to the stories that help us identify as oppressed and oppressors, sometimes within the same breath. That has become the power of Kol Nidre for me, a ritualized acceptance that we as individuals and as a community are simultaneously aspirational in our pursuit of becoming the most loving and just versions of ourselves, but are all too self-aware in recognizing that we also fail to actualize our aspirations. I once found this paradox so confounding, and now it seems liberating.
So,
we want to invite you to mine your own past and moments of extreme emotional gravity and paradox, and use them as a bridge for compassion and perspective on how we can all be oppressed and oppressor at the same time, and what it means to both see and feel that binary, while stretching yourself beyond the binary in the act of creating something more radically compassionate and connected.